Stop whatever you are doing, because what you are about to hear is not a drill, not a simulation, and not the kind of geopolitical speculation that gets walked back by morning. Tonight, the Middle Eastern strategic architecture has been fundamentally and irreversibly transformed by a weapons transfer so catastrophic in its implications that every defense ministry from Washington to Tel Aviv is currently operating under crisis protocols that have not been activated since the darkest hours of the Cold War. Iran has just received from Russia a delivery of 2,000 Kh-47 Mach 2 Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missiles, representing the single largest transfer of advanced strategic weapons in the history of modern warfare, and a number that exceeds the entire combined inventory of operational hypersonic systems possessed by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany combined by a factor of 40. This is not incremental capability enhancement. This is not evolutionary military development. This is the overnight creation of a hypersonic arsenal so overwhelming in its scale, so devastating in its technical sophistication, and so irreversible in its strategic consequences that the entire calculus of power projection, deterrence architecture, and regional dominance has been permanently rewritten. The number 2000 is not arbitrary, not symbolic, not chosen for rhetorical effect. It represents a carefully calibrated threshold, specifically designed to render every existing defensive system in the Middle Eastern theater mathematically incapable of providing meaningful protection against saturation attack scenarios that military planners previously considered theoretical extremes reserved for superpower nuclear exchange contingencies. The Kinzhal, designated Kh-47M2 in Russian military nomenclature and known to NATO intelligence as the AS-24 Killjoy, represents the cutting edge of hypersonic weapon technology currently deployed in operational military service anywhere on Earth. This air-launched ballistic missile achieves terminal velocities exceeding Mach 10, executes continuous random walk evasive maneuvers throughout its entire flight profile, carries either conventional high explosive or nuclear warheads with yields up to 500 kilotons, and operates at altitudes and velocities that place it beyond the engagement envelope of every single air defense system currently protecting Israeli territory, American bases throughout the region, and critical infrastructure assets from Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates. If this channel has been giving you the analysis that cuts through the noise of official narratives and mainstream defense commentary, now is the moment to make sure you never miss an update. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with everyone in your network who is serious about understanding what is actually happening at the sharp edge of global power competition. Because the transfer that occurred 72 hours ago represents a threshold crossing from which there is no return, no reset, no diplomatic resolution that restores the previous strategic equilibrium. The transfer itself was executed with operational security sophistication that completely evaded Western intelligence detection until after the delivery was complete. Russian Il-76 strategic transport aircraft operating on flight profiles deliberately designed to mimic civilian cargo operations executed over 200 sorties across a 72-hour window, each aircraft carrying 10 Kinzhal missiles in specialized climate-controlled transport modules that prevent the sensitive guidance systems and propulsion components from degradation during transit. The aircraft departed from Olenya Air Base in northwestern Russia, transited through Iranian airspace using corridors that American surveillance satellites cannot continuously monitor due to orbital mechanics limitations, and delivered their payloads to hardened underground storage facilities located at sites distributed across Iranian territory in patterns specifically calculated to complicate any potential preemptive strike scenario. Western intelligence agencies became aware of the transfer not through their satellite reconnaissance architecture, not through signals intelligence intercepts, not through human intelligence networks embedded within Russian or Iranian military establishments, but through Russian state media announcements deliberately timed to occur after the transfer was irreversibly complete. This represents sophisticated information warfare strategy that maximizes strategic surprise while avoiding the crisis escalation risk that would accompany detection during the vulnerable transfer phase when aircraft loaded with advanced weapon systems are exposed to potential interdiction. The Iranian military command structure immediately integrated these weapons into operational deployment status, dispersing them across multiple launch platforms that include modified Su-35 fighter aircraft recently delivered from Russia, upgraded F-14 Tomcat interceptors that Iran has maintained in operational service through indigenous parts production and reverse engineering, and potentially modified civilian aircraft that could be converted to launch platforms in scenarios where attribution ambiguity serves strategic purposes. The diversification of launch platforms creates targeting complexity that fundamentally alters the preemptive strike calculations that have historically constrained Iranian military planning. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this transfer and its consequences. The technical capabilities that make the Kinzhal the most lethal air-launched weapon system ever deployed in combat conditions. The operational implications for Israeli air defense architecture that was never designed to handle threats of this velocity, quantity, and sophistication. The strategic paralysis facing American decision-makers confronting a threat environment that their entire force posture was optimized to prevent. The global realignment as regional powers recognize that the military balance has shifted in ways that make previous alliance commitments and security guarantees effectively meaningless. The KH-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missile represents the convergence of 4 decades of Russian aerospace engineering focused specifically on defeating American missile defense systems through velocity, maneuverability, and trajectory unpredictability. The weapon system was first revealed publicly in March 2018 during Russian President Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation address, where it was presented alongside other advanced weapon systems, including the avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle and the Poseidon nuclear-powered underwater drone. Since that initial revelation, the Kinzhal has been deployed operationally in the Ukraine conflict, demonstrating combat effectiveness against defended targets and validating the weapon's ability to penetrate layered air defense architectures. The missile's performance parameters exceed those of every Western hypersonic development program currently in testing phases. The Kinzhal achieves launch from aircraft flying at altitudes between 10 and 15,000 meters, immediately accelerates to hypersonic velocities exceeding Mach 5 within the boost phase, and maintains velocities between Mach 10 and Mach 12 throughout the cruise and terminal attack phases. This velocity profile places the weapon in a regime where aerodynamic heating creates plasma sheaths around the missile body, effectively rendering it invisible to many conventional radar systems that cannot maintain tracking locks on targets surrounded by ionized gas that absorbs and scatters electromagnetic radiation. The missile's maneuvering capability represents the critical technological advancement that separates hypersonic weapons from traditional ballistic missiles. Conventional ballistic missiles follow predictable parabolic trajectories determined by their launch parameters, allowing defensive systems to calculate future positions and position interceptors along projected flight paths. The Kinzhal executes continuous lateral displacement maneuvers throughout its entire flight envelope, using aerodynamic control surfaces effective at hypersonic velocities, combined with thrust vector control from its propulsion system to generate random walk trajectory variations that prevent defensive systems from establishing reliable tracking solutions. The guidance system integrates inertial navigation with GLONASS satellite positioning and active radar terminal guidance, providing accuracy characterized by circular error, probable measurements in single-digit meters, even against moving maritime targets. This precision allows the Kinzhal to be employed against point targets, including command bunkers, radar installations, air defense battery positions, and critical infrastructure nodes with confidence of direct hits that maximize damage effects while minimizing the number of weapons required per target. The warhead options provide tactical flexibility across escalation scenarios. The conventional high-explosive variant carries a 480-kilogram penetrator warhead optimized for destroying hardened underground facilities through kinetic energy transfer at hypersonic impact velocities combined with delayed fuse explosive detonation after penetration. The nuclear variant accommodates warheads with yields between 5 and 500 kilotons, providing options from tactical battlefield employment to strategic city destruction missions depending on operational requirements and political authorization levels. The operational range exceeds 2,000 kilometers when launched from aircraft already airborne and positioned within Iranian airspace, placing every target in Israel, every American military installation in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, and Bahrain, every critical infrastructure node in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and every maritime choke point from the Strait of Hormuz to the Bab el-Mandeb within lethal engagement range. This coverage area transforms Iran from a regional power with primarily defensive military posture into a nation possessing offensive strike capabilities that can hold at risk the entire regional security architecture that the United States has constructed over 7 decades of military presence and alliance building. The defensive challenge posed by this weapon system cannot be overstated. Israel's multi-layered air defense architecture, which represents the most sophisticated and heavily resourced defensive system protecting any nation on Earth, was designed and optimized against threat profiles that the Kinzhal renders obsolete through its performance parameters. The Iron Dome system, which has achieved remarkable success rates against short-range rockets and artillery shells traveling at subsonic velocities along ballistic trajectories, possesses no capability whatsoever against targets moving at Mach 10 and executing unpredictable maneuvers. The system's radar cannot maintain tracking locks. Its interceptor missiles cannot achieve the velocities required to reach intercept geometry, and its engagement doctrine assumes predictable target trajectories that hypersonic maneuvering weapons specifically violate. David's sling, designed to intercept medium-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, faces similar fundamental limitation. The system's Stunner interceptor missile achieves maximum velocities around Mach 7. 5. In optimal conditions, providing insufficient performance margin to reliably intercept targets traveling at Mach 10 while executing evasive maneuvers that force interceptors to burn additional energy matching trajectory changes. The engagement envelope becomes further constrained when accounting for the detection-to-launch timeline required for defensive systems to process tracking data, calculate intercept solutions, and position interceptors along projected flight paths. Against a target traveling at 3 kilometers per second, every second of processing delay translates into 3 kilometers of reduced intercept opportunity. Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, representing Israel's upper-tier ballistic missile defense systems designed specifically to intercept long-range ballistic missiles during their exoatmospheric and terminal phases, were optimized against Iranian and Syrian ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories at velocities substantially below Mach 10. Against the Kinzhal's combination of velocity and maneuverability, these systems face intercept probability degradation to levels that military planners categorize as operationally insignificant. The physics are unforgiving. When defensive interceptors must achieve closure rates against targets moving at hypersonic velocities while compensating for continuous trajectory variations, the fuel requirements and G-force tolerances required exceed the physical capabilities of existing interceptor designs. The Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense System, which the United States has deployed in Israel and throughout the region, and which represents the highest-tier intercept capability available against ballistic threats, was designed and optimized against non-maneuvering re-entry vehicles following predictable ballistic trajectories. Against a maneuvering re-entry vehicle executing lateral displacement maneuvers at hypersonic velocity in the terminal phase, THAAD's intercept probability degrades to levels that render the system effectively decorative rather than functional. The mathematical reality is that 2,000 Kinzhal missiles employed in coordinated salvo attacks against Israeli air defense architecture create scenarios where the defensive systems are simply overwhelmed through numerical superiority, regardless of individual system performance. If Israel's entire integrated air defense network achieves optimistic intercept probabilities of 20% against hypersonic maneuvering targets, a scenario that represents best-case assumptions not validated by any testing against actual Kinzhal equivalent threats. Then a salvo of 100 missiles results in 80 successful penetrations. Against 2,000 missiles employed across multiple attack vectors simultaneously, the defensive architecture collapses mathematically before operational performance degradation from battle damage, ammunition depletion, or electronic warfare effects are even considered. If you want analysis this sharp, this deep, this willing to challenge official narratives, subscribe now to ensure you never miss an update, because what is unfolding is a transformation in regional military balance that defense establishments are struggling to even acknowledge publicly, let alone develop coherent response strategies to address. The operational implications extend far beyond Israeli defensive vulnerability. The United States maintains over 30,000 military personnel across installations in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. Every one of these installations now sits within lethal range of a weapon system against which American defensive capabilities are marginally more effective than Israeli systems, which is to say, effectively useless. The Patriot air defense systems protecting these bases were designed in the 1980s to intercept Soviet aircraft and cruise missiles traveling at subsonic or low supersonic velocities. Against Mach 10 maneuvering targets, Patriot batteries provide psychological comfort to the personnel they ostensibly protect, but offer no meaningful defensive capability. American carrier strike groups operating in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters face unprecedented vulnerability. The scenario that has haunted American naval planners since the advent of hypersonic weapons is the saturation attack, where dozens of missiles arrive simultaneously from multiple vectors against a carrier battle group whose defensive systems were optimized for sequential threat engagement. The Kinzhal's range and velocity compress decision timelines to windows measured in seconds rather than minutes, forcing defensive weapon systems to operate in fully autonomous modes where human decision-making is physically impossible within available time constraints. The Aegis combat system aboard American cruisers and destroyers represents the most sophisticated naval air defense architecture ever deployed, but its effectiveness against hypersonic salvos remains unproven in combat conditions and highly questionable according to independent technical assessments. The strategic calculations facing decision-makers in Washington and Tel Aviv have been fundamentally transformed. The previous deterrence architecture rested on the assumption that Iran's military capabilities, while substantial, remained confined to domains where American and Israeli technological superiority provided decisive advantages. Iranian ballistic missiles could be intercepted by advanced air defense systems. Iranian naval forces could be destroyed by American carrier aviation and precision strike capabilities. Iranian air defenses could be suppressed by stealth aircraft and electronic warfare systems. This layered superiority across multiple domains created a strategic environment where military options remained available to Western decision-makers contemplating responses to Iranian regional activities. That strategic environment no longer exists. Iran now possesses the capability to inflict catastrophic damage against Israeli population centers, American military installations, and regional allied infrastructure, regardless of Western military responses. The introduction of 2,000 hypersonic missiles creates a threat that cannot be neutralized through preemptive strikes, cannot be defended against through existing air defense architecture, and cannot be deterred through conventional military superiority. The only remaining deterrent is nuclear retaliation, which raises the threshold for Western military action to levels where most conceivable contingencies fall below the threshold that would justify civilizational suicide. Israel faces impossible choices: a preemptive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, an option that has remained on the table for over 2 decades as a last resort preventing Iranian nuclear breakout, now carries the near certainty of Iranian retaliation with hypersonic weapons that could kill tens of thousands of Israeli civilians in attacks that air defense systems cannot prevent. The cost-benefit calculation that previously made preemptive strikes conceivable as desperate measures now makes them suicidal gambits that no rational leadership would authorize. American security guarantees to regional allies have been exposed as hollow promises backed by insufficient capability. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf states that have oriented their security policies around American protection now recognize that American forces cannot protect themselves, let alone their regional partners, against the threat environment that Iran has created. The gravitational pull toward accommodation with Tehran becomes irresistible when the alternative is destruction that American military power cannot prevent. The Russia-China-Iran axis has achieved a strategic breakthrough that fundamentally alters the global balance of power. Russia's willingness to transfer its most advanced offensive weapons to Iran demonstrates a level of strategic coordination that renders Western efforts to maintain pressure on Moscow through regional proxies effectively meaningless. China's tacit support for these transfers, evidenced by its silence and continued economic engagement with both Russia and Iran despite Western sanctions, reveals a coordinated strategy among major powers challenging American hegemony. The transfer validates the long-term strategic patience that Iran has demonstrated across 4 decades of sustained pressure, sanctions, isolation, and military threats. The Islamic Republic has survived assassination campaigns targeting its nuclear scientists, cyber attacks destroying its nuclear centrifuges, comprehensive economic sanctions devastating its economy, and constant military pressure from adversaries possessing overwhelming conventional superiority. Through all of this pressure, Iran maintained its strategic course, developed indigenous defense capabilities, cultivated relationships with Russia and China, and waited for the moment when the correlation of forces would shift in its favor. That moment has arrived. Iran now possesses the military capability to fundamentally reshape the Middle Eastern order through demonstrated power rather than rhetorical defiance. The 2,000 Kinzhal missiles represent not merely weapons, but strategic leverage that can be employed to extract concessions, deter adversaries, and establish regional dominance in ways that were impossible when Iran's military capabilities remained confined to defensive systems and short-range offensive weapons. Regional powers are conducting urgent strategic reassessments. Turkey, which has maintained complex relationships with both Western allies and regional rivals, now recognizes that the military balance has shifted in ways that make continued alignment with NATO's Middle Eastern policies potentially fatal to Turkish interests. Pakistan, which possesses nuclear weapons but lacks delivery systems approaching the sophistication of the Kinzhal, sees validation of its own strategic relationship with China and its hedging behavior toward Iran. Egypt and Jordan, which have maintained peace agreements with Israel predicated on assumptions of Israeli military dominance, must recalculate whether those agreements remain viable when the underlying power balance has been fundamentally altered. The Global South is interpreting these developments as evidence that American hegemonic control can be successfully challenged through patient strategic planning, cultivation of alternative power relationships, and willingness to accept short-term costs in pursuit of long-term strategic autonomy. Nations from Latin America to Southeast Asia are observing that Iran has achieved through persistence and alliance formation what decades of American pressure could not prevent, creating demonstration effects that encourage other nations to pursue independent strategic courses regardless of American preferences. The international order constructed after the Cold War around assumptions of unipolar American dominance is collapsing in real time. The transfer of 2,000 hypersonic missiles to Iran represents one of the clearest indicators yet that we are living through a hegemonic transition comparable to the collapse of British imperial dominance in the mid-20th century or the decline of Spanish power in the 17th century. These transitions are never smooth, never peaceful, and never reversible once the fundamental shifts in capability and will have occurred. The world will never be the same. There is no going back to the strategic environment that existed 72 hours ago. There is no diplomatic resolution that restores the previous balance. There is no military technology that can be rapidly developed and deployed to neutralize the advantage that Iran has achieved. History will mark this transfer as the moment when American dominance in the Middle East ended not with dramatic military defeat, but through the quiet accumulation of capabilities by adversaries who never accepted the inevitability of permanent subordination. Subscribe to this channel because in a world this dangerous, analysis this sharp is not optional, it is necessary. What is your assessment of where this goes from here? Has this transfer permanently altered the Middle Eastern power balance, or will Washington find a way to reassert dominance? Leave your analysis in the comments below, because this community represents some of the most sophisticated strategic thinking available anywhere outside classified briefing rooms. Tonight represents a turning point that future historians will study as the inflection point where the unipolar moment finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The transfer of 2,000 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles to Iran demonstrates that patient strategic planning, cultivation of great power relationships, and willingness to endure short-term costs can overcome even the most overwhelming conventional military superiority. Your engagement keeps this work independent and sharp. Share this analysis with everyone who needs to understand what is actually at stake, because the transformation we are witnessing will define the international order for generations. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop asking the questions that matter.